Hi there, I'm Elspeth from Ragged Life, and this is the third video in my peg loom weaving series where I'll actually be teaching you how to do the weaving itself. Fun times. If you're interested in seeing how to actually set up the peg loom like I've got here, or to know what equipment you need to be able to do this technique, you might want to check out either my first or my second video in the series. But for the moment, I'm going to assume that everyone's raring to go and set up with me. So this particular technique builds up rugs or placemats or bags that look a little bit like this one here. It's really good for creating a nice striped pattern a lot of the time, and it's probably one of the quickest and easiest techniques to build a rag rug quickly. So I'm all set up here. I've mentioned this briefly in my previous videos, but I'm going to be demoing today with our Ragged Life woolen blanket yarn, which comes in these 250 gram balls. It's just so that I don't have to cut loads of strips to be able to demo with. I could equally be working with strips of cotton. This is just an old sheet that I've joined together. Or I could be working with sari silk ribbon, literally anything, as long as it's cut into strips and joined together. It doesn't matter what you're working with. The only difference is the row of holes that I would be working in. So I'm going to grab this ball here, and the first thing that I'm going to do is, whatever you're working with, you want to find the end of your strip. So I've got it here. It doesn't matter if you start off weaving from the left of the peg loom or the right of the peg loom, wherever works for you. But you can see that I've got my warps coming away from me because it's just much easier to not having them tangled up in your lap. So first thing that I'm going to do to start the peg loom weaving is I'm going to take the end of the strip and I'm going to put it in front of the first peg, for me on the left. And I want to leave a tail. So I've left a bit of a tail that's approximately the height of this first peg in terms of length. Then what I'm doing is I'm weaving in and out between the pegs. So forward, behind, forward, behind, forward, behind, forward, behind. And you can see that I'm kind of like just serpentining between them. If you've got a strip of fabric, I would deliberately try not to keep it completely flat into the peg loom. So I tend to twist my fabric a little bit as I'm working, because when you come to compress your peg loom weaving, it tends to squidge up a bit better, for lack of technical word, better if you don't keep the strips totally flat into the pegs themselves. Then when you reach the final peg over here on the right, you come around the final peg, and then you just start weaving back the direction you've just come. So whereas in the previous row I was in front of the peg, I'll now be behind the peg. So you're almost on the opposite side of the peg to the row below. And you can see that I'm just kind of occasionally just pushing my peg loom weaving down, and I tend to kind of do that quite regularly just to make sure that my tension is kind of looking good. Then when you reach the first peg where you've got this tail here, I like to sew in my tails as I go along, as opposed to having to do them at the end of the project. To be honest, the first few rows of peg loom weaving always looks like a bit of a dog's dinner, so you have to come back and tidy them up, but it just makes me feel good sewing in this first tail as I go. So what I do is I almost imagine that that first tail is glued to the first peg. So I almost like take it vertically up the peg, and then I wrap around it as if it was just the peg. So wrap around it nice and firmly, and then you just keep sewing that in every time you reach that first peg. So I've come around the peg, and then I'm just on the opposite side of the pegs to the row below. So I'm forward, backwards, forwards, backwards, just weaving along. Once again, when you reach the final peg, make sure that you go around it firmly, but not yanking it really tight, because you need to be able to take the peg out eventually. And if you go too tight, it's going to be hard to pull the peg out. If you go too loose, you're just going to end up with quite an uneven tension. With the blanket yarn that I'm working with, every now and then I have these blanket tassels that come through the blanket yarn. It's just because it's the end of a blanket and the tassel that's at the end, joining onto the tassel of a new blanket and continuing on. I just keep weaving with them as they are because it just becomes part of the peg loom woven pattern, these kind of like nice little cream off-white bits running through it. But you can equally kind of cut them out and sew the strips of actual blanket together if you want a totally clean look to your weaving. But I actually really like that this is the ultimate recycling. Not only are we working with the blanket, but we're also working with the tassels themselves. So you can see that I'm just kind of making my way up and along the peg loom weaving, like so. How the peg loom weaving looks on the pegs is how the peg loom weaving will eventually look when it comes off the peg loom in terms of denseness and design. So my tip would be, anytime that you don't like how something is looking, don't keep going with it. If you don't like it now, you're unlikely to like it when it comes off the peg loom. So fix any kind of like, I don't know, design choices there and then. So you can see that I'm making pretty good progress with this because my fabric is quite thick. It's building up the pegs very, very quickly. That's why I love working with this blanket yarn because it's very easy to do things quickly. But if I was working with something like knitting wool, then it would take me much longer to build up this kind of height. But you keep going with your weaving until you're roughly about, I would say about 2 to 3 centimeters away from the tops of the pegs. So you can see I've built up quite a bit of weaving at this stage. You don't keep going right to the tops of the pegs because otherwise what happens is when we do the next part of the process, which is called advancing the warp, so that's transferring all of this weaving that's on our pegs onto the warp in front of us. If you weave too close to the tops of the pegs, it starts to unravel as you're working, which just makes your life a nightmare. So leave a little bit of extra room at the top. Then you can see that the tail that I'm working with is over here on the right side of my loom. You start from the other end of the peg loom and you're pulling the peg out of the loom. So I'm just going to give that a pull and a wiggle. And can you see I'm pulling the warp through the weaving itself. Then you replace the peg back into the hole that you just took it out of. So you're not going into another row of holes, you're going into the same hole that you just took it out of. So I've got the warp coming away from my body, so I will always pull the peg towards my body. So you always pull it the opposite direction. So I'm pulling it up and then bring it towards myself. Bring it up, bring it towards myself, replace it in the hole it came out of. You can see why you don't want to get too close to the tops of the pegs because otherwise it starts to pop off. And you just take it out, replace it in, take it out, replace it in, and you keep going one peg at a time. And depending on how kind of tight your pegs are into the holes, you may need to give your kind of pegs a bit of a wiggle to loosen them up. Often when you get a new peg loom, they tend to be a little bit stiff into the holes and then they loosen up over time. But all I'm doing is just pulling the weaving, the warp through the weaving and just replacing it into the holes. Then I always stop when I'm about three pegs from the end of the peg loom. You see that one's a bit harder. Just give it a wiggle. So I stop when I'm 3 pegs from the end of the loom, and then what I do is I actually start weaving my next row. So I've kind of gone around the peg at exactly the same tension as I've been doing previously, and then I continue weaving on, forwards, backwards, to the other side of the loom. And only once I've started weaving that next row do I then advance the warp on the final 3 pegs. And the reason why I do that is because it helps you get an even tension on the turn, whereas if you take all of the pegs out, it's hard to get an even tension on the turn. It also means that you remember which way you're coming around the final peg. Because if you take all of this weaving off, it's really difficult to see whether you go in front or behind of the warp when you start your next row. So I've now replaced that in, and you can see that the weaving is starting to build down the warp. And then you just keep going as you were. And you're just making sure, as I said, that you're keeping your tension fairly even, so don't kind of like tug it really tight on the corners, the turns. You can normally tell if you're tugging it a bit tight on the turn, because what will happen is that your peg will start to angle inwards like this, as opposed to standing straight, and you'll really be struggling to get your peg out of the hole. So I'm just continuing on for maybe like, I don't know, I'll do one more row, and then I'll show you how you go about changing colour. Because you can approach design in terms of, you could cut up a whole load of strips of fabric on, in a couple of evenings, join them all together on the sewing machine and create what's called a hit and miss rug, where it just patterns however it patterns, which looks amazing and is great for scrap busting. But sometimes you may want to create a specific design like I'm doing today. In which case, what you would do is, when you kind of have, I don't know, decided that you want to change colour, like I have here, you would weave to the end of a row. You would cut the fabric, then you would take your next colour that you're going to be working with. You start with your new strip on the right side of the loom. So once again, you leave a tail that's about the height of the peg, of the first peg, and then you make sure that you're on the opposite side of the peg to the row below. So I normally look at the second one to work out whether I should be in front or behind. And then once again, you start peg loom weaving across. And this is what I was saying about trying to occasionally twist the fabric, because you can see here it's flat into the loom, but here it's twisted and it looks a bit better. Then when you reach the kind of final peg that has your original tail, you're sewing that up, the peg, in exactly the same way as we did at the beginning. So imagine that this is glued to the first peg. And then I wrap nice and kind of firmly around it. And then I just keep weaving back the way I came. And you may need to occasionally just give that a tug just to tighten it up. And then once again, you sew in this tail up this peg. So imagine it's glued to that peg, wrap around it nice and firmly, come back the way you came. And you keep weaving, sewing up your tails on each side of the peg loom, like so. And push it down occasionally just to get it all nice and dense. And then I'm going to keep going until I've got a bit more, because I'll show you how to advance the warp one last time, just so that you've got it kind of clear in your mind. So now I'm about kind of maybe 3 centimeters from the tops of the pegs. So I'm going to advance the warp. Actually, I'm going to do one more row, and the only reason why I'm doing this extra row is because the more I can kind of wrap around those tails on the right and the left of the peg loom, the better really, because I'll snip that off eventually. Wow, that blanket yarn's looking quite nice actually, so I'm quite pleased with that. So I'm going to start on the opposite side to where my tail is, pull the peg out, replace it back into the hole it came from. Take my next peg, replace it back into the hole it just came from. And just remember that you're trying to leave 3 of the pegs in the peg loom, so don't go all the way to the end. Like so. And you can see that I'm actually kind of holding the pegs as I go along, because it just prevents any of the pegs from popping out once I've put them in. If you're finding that your peg is popping out when you put it into the peg loom, it's generally because you need to pull a decent amount of this warp through. Don't only pull a little bit through, because it'll almost not have enough give to stay properly into the hole. You need to have a bit of slack. Sometimes, so now I've got 3 left in, that's when I start weaving my next row, and make sure that you're keeping your tension the same as previously, and just keep weaving across. And then once you're further away from those 3, that's when you advance the warp. So continue on taking out the pegs. And you can see now it's starting to come together. So when the weaving is building down the warp, it tends to be quite loose because there's nothing for it to kind of butt up against. Particularly the first 3 rows, we always come back and fix them. It's only at the end of the project when we almost like concertina things up, almost like pulling a drawstring hoodie, that things start to look the correct denseness. So what you can do is sometimes people like to pull these strands and just almost like pull them at the bottom to get the weaving a bit denser and more kind of tightened up against the pegs at the top. So you can just give them a little tug, and you can see how that's now sitting a bit higher against my peg loom, like so. So that's basically how you go about doing the peg loom weaving. I'm now just going to briefly explain some of the kind of basic mistakes that people make when they're doing the weaving itself, just so you know what to watch out for if you're a beginner. So the first one that I see most commonly is accidentally missing out a peg. So you keep going backwards, forwards, but you can see here I've ended up having 2 where I'm going behind the peg, and then I've switched back to exactly how I should be. What happens there is in the body of your weaving, you'll end up with a long loop which isn't held down by the warp. And it's not all that obvious because it'll be the same colours as these, so it's not the end of the world, but it will kind of show a little bit and it's more likely to get caught. You can normally catch yourself and see when you're doing this because you'll end up on the same side of the pegs as the row below. So you can just undo it, find where you went wrong and kind of go back to there like that. The next thing people do wrong is leaving it baggy or pulling it too tight on the turn. So if you leave it baggy, and often people start off with their weaving a bit loose, then what will happen is you won't end up with a nice even like straight edge on the side. You'll end up with some bits kind of bagging out and some bits pulling in. You want to make sure that you're trying to keep the turns roughly kind of similar in terms of how much you're pulling it, like this. The majority of the other mistakes people make are on advancing the warp. So when you come to do the advancing of the warp, the first thing that people do, and normally, as I said, you could keep weaving a bit more than I've got here, but you can advance the warp at any stage. So I'm going to just demo with a little bit of it now, once I'm at one side of the loom. So the first thing that people do is that when they pull these kind of like pegs through, it's very easy to accidentally catch the fabric into the hole and almost clip the fabric when you replace the peg into the hole. And if you do that, what happens is it's not the end of the world. You just need to find the peg that's accidentally clipped the fabric and just pull it out. But what will happen, I'll show you, is that it won't kind of come onto the warp. It'll get kind of held here so that it kind of can't move on. When that happens, you just find where the peg was and you just pull it out and just release the fabric that was caught underneath so that it all comes off. The next thing people do is accidentally weaving too close to the tops of the pegs, and what happens then is it starts to fall off as you're working, which means that it's very easy to accidentally get mixed up whether you were in front or behind. And you can imagine if this weaving starts to come off and you're pulling these pegs out, it's very easy for mistakes to happen. The next one, which is a really important one and probably the one that's kind of most commonly done, is sometimes people accidentally, when they're pulling this peg through, they'll accidentally catch through a neighbouring warp strand when they place this peg back into the hole. You need to make sure that your warp strands are staying straight and that you're not catching any of the neighbouring ones when you pull through. The other one is at the very beginning of the peg loom weaving, when you're pulling your kind of peg through for the first time. When you have the warp coming away from you, you always pull the peg towards you. If, however, you had the warp coming towards you, sometimes people prefer that, when you pull this peg through, you would have to go away from you. So you do it the opposite to the direction that the warp is coming away from you. And it's much easier at the beginning, when you've got no weaving going on here, to accidentally pull the peg the wrong way when you're replacing it into the hole. So just make sure that you're going the right direction. And then the last one is this thing of, I've made sure that I've left 3 pegs in at the end of my advancing. If, however, you take out all of your pegs, like I'm about to do, don't do this at home, then what happens is your peg loom weaving will all be sat here and it'll all look quite nice and normal. But when you're here, you have to work out, was I supposed to be in front of this peg or was I supposed to be behind this peg? And it's very easy, if you weren't supposed to go round that peg, if you were supposed to be in front of it, to accidentally pull this in too tight and then pull the edge in so that it's not going to stay straight on the sides. So that's why we always leave our final 3 pegs in and start weaving our next row. You can look at the warp strands and work out whether you were in front or behind. So here I can see I was behind this one, in front of this one. So I've got to come round and keep weaving like this. But it's much easier to just not do it in the first place. Right, so I'm going to do a bit more weaving with this one here and make my little doormat, but in my next video I'm going to show you how you go about finishing off at the end of your peg loom weaving, and I'm actually going to be taking this big boy sari silk woven rug off this 90 centimeter Ragged Life peg loom, so that you can see how you go about tidying things up and finishing things off at the end. So thank you so much for watching. Definitely hit subscribe if you want more rag rug videos, and good luck with your project.